This video discusses controversial ideas and includes content which does not reflect my own views for the sole purpose of education. Any hoodles, have y'all been on Instagram lately? I legitimately have no idea how much of this stuff I can show on YouTube, so I guess I'm gonna roll the dice with some of the less spicy stuff I was able to find. But suffice it to say, there is a metric ton of blatant, unironic, anti-Semitic content on Instagram. Not just like funny hat-wearing memes, but like full-on Hitler was the good guy memes. And I realize that the same is true about X, but X has been the wild, wild Kanye West for a hot minute now, so I don't think it's really as noteworthy as Big Daddy Zuckbucks letting Instagram go full Nazi. So what's going on here? Is there actually more anti-Semitic content online than there was, say, 5 years ago? Yes. But are there actually more anti-Semitic people out there? Also, definitely yes. However, I think that these are two different phenomena, which are related but independent. The undeniable fact that there are more anti-Semitic people out there than there were 5 years ago is probably mostly due to something called concept creep, which is the gradual expansion of the definition of a term. And because the term anti-Semitism is now applicable to such an absurdly broad range of people, it has emboldened actual anti-Semites to come out of the woodwork and be much more public and vocal with their point of view.
I'm comfortable being called a Nazi. You think there's some other word that will hurt my feelings?
Historically speaking, anti-Semitism was defined as hatred of or bigotry towards the Jewish people. However, since the 1970s, the concept of a new anti-Semitism has emerged, which essentially posits that any criticism of the Israeli government or the Zionist project in the state of Israel as a whole should also be classified as anti-Semitism. To quote Abba Eban, Israeli UN ambassador of 1973, the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism. And more recently, in 2018, the government of Israel passed and codified the Basic Law, which officially defines Israel as the nation-state and national home of the Jewish people. Now, it should be obvious to anyone with a functioning brainstem that a racial identity and a government are two different things. But that has not stopped senior members of the Israeli government, both in speech and policy, to attempt to conflate and push together these two concepts and make them synonymous. The obvious intent of this, of course, is that it would allow for the term anti-Semite to be weaponized. If the state of Israel and the Jewish racial identity are the same thing, then any criticism of the Israeli government would be anti-Semitic by definition. So I guess it's a good thing that the Israeli government has never done anything worthy of criticism, right? It's hard to know exactly what to say about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that your perspective on it really depends on what point in history you start telling the story. And by now, there's an entire century of events to choose from as a starting point. But for many people who never did or never would have paid much attention to it otherwise, the story begins on October 7th of 2023. Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel from the Gaza Strip, killing about 1,200 people and taking around 240 hostages. The extent of the attack marked a remarkable, almost unbelievable failure of Israeli intelligence. Especially when you consider the fact that the attack was used as justification to begin a brutal military campaign, which has resulted in the deaths of over 60,000 Palestinians, of which, according to the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, 70% were women and children. And according to the IPC, as of August 2025, about 1.9 million people in Gaza, or about 85% of its population, do not have reliable access to food and water, with 641,000 people experiencing extreme starvation conditions. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not this should be classified as a genocide, even though it should, mostly because I think there's been more effort into debating the semantics of that term than there has been to actually doing something about the situation. But regardless of what name you call it by, it is clear that the actions of the Israeli government since October 7th have been horrendously unpopular, drawing international condemnation from around the globe. And at every turn, Israel has used accusations of anti-Semitism to defend itself. For example, in early 2024, when the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials citing war crimes against Palestinians, Benjamin Netanyahu labeled these arrest warrants as a hate crime, calling the ICC prosecutor one of the, quote, great anti-Semites in modern times. Less than a month later, Netanyahu would double down on this, stating in a press conference that anti-Jewish prejudice was the only plausible reason why people paid so much attention to the human toll in Gaza. He went on to say, there is a virus that has accompanied us for millennia now, a virus of anti-Semitism. We established a state to be able to physically fight against those who would kill us. If we don't stand together to rebuff these attacks, then no one else will for us. There are quite literally hundreds of examples of this fucking scumbag using anti-Semitism as a shield to defend the Israeli government from criticism. Just look up Benjamin Netanyahu anti-Semitism and just any fucking speech, any speech he's given for the last 50 years. All this to say, if you are critical of anything that the Israeli government has done in response to the October 7th attack, you are an anti-Semite. And according to 3 different polls by Reuters, Gallup, and AP, so are 60% of your fellow Americans, which means that there are over 200 million anti-Semites in this country. But something else has started happening since October 7th. Well, with all this hubbub about Gaza, people have started noticing a lot of really weird shit about the relationship between the US and Israel. For instance, over the years, Israel has received approximately $310 billion in total economic and military aid from the U.S., making it by far the largest cumulative recipient of such funding. In the year following October 7th alone, the U.S. approved nearly $18 billion in military aid to Israel. In 2013, a top-secret document leaked by Edward Snowden revealed that the NSA routinely shares unfiltered intelligence data about U.S. citizens with Israel, to include things like personal identifying information, emails, and recorded phone calls. And as of now, 38 different states have passed bills and executive orders designed to actively penalize any entities that boycott against Israel, otherwise known as anti-BDS laws. This last one, the only reason I know about it is because it actually came to a head very recently here in the great nation of Texas. In April of 2025, members of the San Marcos City Council, spurred on by a local grassroots pro-Palestinian movement, introduced a resolution calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and a recognition of Palestinian sovereignty. This was largely symbolic, but apparently it was important enough for Governor Greg Hot Wheels Abbott himself to write a letter of condemnation threatening to withhold state funding for vital city infrastructure if the resolution were passed. In his own words, "I have repeatedly made clear that Texas will not tolerate anti-Semitism. Anti-Israel policies are anti-Texas policies." And as a Texan, I'll tell you what, that do rustle my jimmies a bit.
Well, after a threat of losing state funding, the City of San Marcos Council rejected a resolution to formally call for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Okay, the motion fails with 5 noes and 2 yeses.
So that completes that. Y'all have done really. And if you feel the need to yell, exit the building.
Anyway, the point of all this is the U.S. and Israel have a very weird relationship that involves you giving a lot of your money and personal information to Israel without consent. And if you take issue with that, well, you're an anti-Semite, apparently. And you know who else takes issue with that? Well, a lot of people in the conservative, libertarian, and America First region of the political spectrum. At least according to Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, Matt Walsh, Candace Owens, Thomas Massey, Dave Smith, Megyn Kelly, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, all of whom have had sharp vocal criticism for Israel over the past few years. And to be completely clear, most of those people have also spoken out against the brutality in Gaza. I don't want to make it seem like conservatives only care about fiscal stuff. I'm just pointing out that even just being a fiscal conservative and wanting to prioritize domestic spending over foreign aid makes you an anti-Semite. So from where I'm sitting, I think that 60% of Americans being anti-Semitic figure that I threw out earlier is probably pretty low. We're probably closer to like 90, 95%. Now, I'm reasonably sure that the overwhelming majority of people who are now technically anti-Semites would never self-identify as such, just like I would never self-identify as an anti-vaxxer. But this is the consequence of concept creep. If you synonymize criticism of the Israeli government with a hatred of the Jewish people, eventually the term becomes so broad that it doesn't mean anything anymore, especially if you do it at the same time that the Israeli government is committing crimes against humanity en masse. This weaponization of the term delegitimizes actual anti-Semitism and gives actual anti-Semites cover to be more public than they otherwise would be. This is why you're seeing such a huge explosion of anti-Semitic content on platforms like Instagram and X.
So what do we do about all of this? Well, I think we could probably start with an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, just like stop bombing women and children and maybe give food and water to the hundreds of thousands of people that are starving there. That would be pretty cool. I don't know if there's anything that could possibly rehabilitate the Israeli government's public image at this point, but that would certainly help. We as Americans have so much leverage in this situation. Like, none of this would be happening if we weren't paying for it. And that's the thing that pisses me off the most. Your tax dollars are paying for this shit. Why? Anyway, I just want to make it clear, I'm not an anti-Semite, at least not in the way that I consider the term to be meaningful. I don't condone Nazism or anything even close to it. But at the same time, if the definition of anti-Semite has changed and will remain anyone who is critical of the Israeli government, also, I wasn't sure where to put it in the video, but I do think it's a little bit weird that the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak visited Jeffrey Epstein like 30 times after he was convicted of sex trafficking children and also went to his private island. Like, I don't know what to do with that information. I'm just going to give it to you and say, the whole Jeffrey Epstein Israeli intelligence connection thing there's a lot there, and I don't know what to do with it. Ugh.